Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
So this is actually part 2 of what's turning out to be a 3-part talk, as they often do with me, or 27 parts, whichever the case may be. And it has 2 titles, actually. The one title is on being not good enough and working with the critical voice. And we'll get into a little bit more next time on just being not enough. You know, the ways that we encounter difficulties that we are just not enough for. So we'll extend it out to that. And tonight I want to expand out a little bit. First of all, I'll review just a little bit what we talked about last time, and I ended promising you a story, so I will tell you the story. And but I want to expand out to not just our own self-critical voice, but the critical voice. We can be critical of ourselves and we can be critical of others. And so to kind of look at how that critical voice develops, what's it doing, and how is it useful, and then ultimately how to work with it. And one of the challenges that I find sometimes in the instructions on how to work with it kind of amount to don't do that. And the risk, I think, of that instruction is that we can develop a critical voice about the critical voice, about having a critical voice, about having a critical voice. It can be kind of endless. And so I wanted to kind of try to tease it apart a little bit so that we actually have some way of A, understanding what's happening here, and B, how to work with it. So the title is on being not good enough, on being not good enough. And last time, I'm going to start the same way I did last time with a quote from Trungpa Rinpoche. He says, meditation practice is not an exotic or out of reach approach. It is immediate and personal, and it involves an intimate relationship with ourselves. Getting to know ourselves by examining our actual experience without being ashamed of it. So without being critical of it, without being ashamed of it. Just do something here so I can see you just a little bit here. Let's do this. No, that's not working. All right. So I wanted to start by inviting you to contemplate for a minute. When you are intimate with others, and intimacy can be a lot of things. It can be the people you live with, or it can be the people whose lives you observe every day and January 6th hearings. When you are intimate with others, what do you view? I just want you to contemplate that you judge harshly or criticize, thinking that they should be otherwise. Just think about that for a minute. Are there any beings anywhere in the universe that you judge harshly or criticize, thinking that they should be otherwise? Sometimes we don't have to look further than our own kitchen table, our dining room table. That's one question. So second question, when you are intimate with yourself, What do you experience? Do you experience anything that you judge or criticize, thinking that it or you should be otherwise? And I'll just note, and I'll probably say this again in the course of the evening, but often in periods of especially extended relationships with others or extended meditation practice with ourselves, like on, say, a retreat, we can encounter experience that we find it hard to befriend, that we really are quite convinced this should be otherwise. So I want to ask you, as we begin, would anyone like to form a question about this critical voice that we might inquire into together this evening, maybe this evening in a couple of weeks? I can think of an example. For example, and it comes up sometimes on retreat, that somebody will be kind of flooded with experience, there's something that comes up that you go, clearly, this is not what's supposed to be happening on retreat. I'm enraged. I'm ready to murder the person who's sitting next to me who keeps making noise, and they're not supposed to be making noise. They're snoring, like we were talking, so that, we can, I'm not, first of all, they're not supposed to be snoring because we're supposed to be meditating. And secondly, I'm not supposed to be as pissed off as I am about it. There's, what am I supposed to be doing otherwise? In that moment. So the last week I spoke about, how we don't actually often, when we talk about being in the present moment, knowing what's going on in our meditation practice, we often don't want to. So that maybe one of the functions of the critic is to try to help us not pay attention to what's going on in our experience, and that we often don't want to know. We'll talk a little bit about that tonight. And David White, I spoke last time, speaks of that as the frontier. I like that word. He calls it the foreign unexplored land between, this is important, between what we are comfortable with, what we are familiar with, and what we want to be true, and how it is. So he speaks of that place as the foreign land. So I want to talk briefly, I want to tell you the story. And, we talked a little bit last time about the difference between the absolute and the relative. And I said I had a story from the world of form that I think can help us a little bit with some of the questions about what's going on here. Maybe, I hope it helps, if not. Now, let me tell you my story. So my story is about a house guest I had some years ago who came and visited for a long weekend. And we had just had a very fine time. We had a lovely time. We had hiked in the woods, and we'd come home, and together we'd cooked dinner, had some great meals. We made brownies for dessert. We had long talks about all sorts of things. And we'd spent quiet and cozy evenings reading by the fire. It was kind of early spring. Yeah, early spring. So we still had a fire. My guest was almost ready to leave, and we were walking together quietly in the in the backyard, wandering, just holding hands and commenting on, the little sprouts. You know how the little sprouts, they start to come up in the spring. When suddenly he broke away from me, ran around to the front of the house, and hit the young woman who was sitting on the porch. All right, that's the end of my story. Well, it's almost the end of the story. So this is actually working toward a clarification of one of the questions. We could kind of look and see, well, what comes up for you? When you think about just being with how it is. And then one of the questions was, aren't I accepting the unacceptable? So I want to make a distinction here, which is sometimes a hard distinction to make, between discerning something that is unskillful and judging it. So we could notice that it is very likely unskillful that my guest ran around to the front of the house and hit the young woman who was sitting on the porch, right? We could probably agree that that might not be the world's most skillful move. Granted? Okay, we good? So we're not talking about saying, oh, honey, that was a great idea, or that was a good thing to do. So when we're talking about the critical voice, or letting go of the critical voice, we're not talking about letting go of our minds or letting go of discernment and noticing when something is causing suffering for ourselves, or for someone else. We're not talking about abandoning discernment. This is suffering. This is unskillful. But we could also notice that maybe along with that discernment, there are some kind of questions or confusions that arise. I don't know, any pop-up words? What comes up for you when you hear that story? Anybody confused? What just happened? What was that? Who was that masked man? So in this moment, we can, along with what Linda is saying, notice that we can, go very quickly from discernment that was unskillful to a harsh judgment. I deliberately misled you in the story by not telling you that he was 5. But it still leaves us, doesn't it, with some kind of question of like, well, what did happen? What was that? And that we can very often, in that place of confusion, move very quickly to try to solve the confusion. Ajahn Suchito talks about the critical voice about ourselves or others. He talks about it as an inner tyrant, and there's a whole book that he wrote. I put it in the references. He says an inner tyrant is a voice that drives ourselves or others in a way that doesn't nourish. And I would propose that doesn't lead to the end of suffering. that sets up a lot of goals that we or others are unlikely to achieve anytime soon. This inner tyrant speaks in terms of shoulds. I should, you should, they should. In compulsions, it must be a certain way. He speaks of the inner tyrant as speaking in terms of never and always, a lot of recrimination, and he calls it a mood that sees without love or grace. A sense of, in the case of the inner critic, the critic of ourselves, a sense of, I didn't quite make it and I'm not likely to. We can identify that, at least I can sometimes, in terms of, any kind of enlightenment. I didn't quite make it and really not likely to. And a sense that there could be a way out if I just tried a little bit harder or did something to fix myself, then I would be okay. So a little bit more of the story. Indeed, the little one was indeed 5 years old. He ran and hit his sister, socking her hard in the head and making her cry. And their parents, who were in the final moments of packing the car before they left, responded with outrage and punishment and reactivity. And so the leave taking was filled with all kinds of recriminations and chaos and, shouting and tears, and everybody drove away in quite uproar. And in that moment, really, we could, I mean, I can talk to you about what I realized had happened, but in that moment, we could just move very quickly from confusion to trying to fix it somehow, to trying to fix, in this case, our own internal discomfort. And for that matter, we could imagine, you could even imagine, well, here are the parents, and here's something is happening that they did not want to be happening. And so, then there's this response. Now we could move to judgment about the parents, we say, well, I don't want that to be happening. So we could be, the critic can go on endlessly. But we could imagine that these parents, experience something is happening that they don't want to be happening. And so they're moving very quickly into action, trying to make it not be that way. Or to not be, I don't know, we could even imagine maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe, here's their child who's behaving badly. Or, we could kind of imagine all sorts of possibilities for the uncomfortable experience that they might be having, that they don't want to be having. And so instead, they're kind of moving outward into judgment or criticism. Like any situation, remember the Buddhist story about the blind man and the elephant, or actually it's not just the Buddhist story, where when we don't necessarily know what's going on, we can have all kinds of theories about it. And for that matter, somebody referenced this in one of your questions. I think maybe it was Neil. But how people who have different views, different expectations for how something should unfold. So if we release judgment and simply allow the perspective for just a moment that something there happened that was difficult, and that for many of us might bring up confusion. Actually, at that moment, it brought up a lot of confusion for me with all the chaos that was going on. And I later talked to a friend of mine who sorted it out, and just don't want to leave that one hanging. What we realized was that that little one was having an experience that he did not want to be having, which was he was sad. And he was only 5, and so he didn't know how to navigate feeling sad. He knew how to navigate how to punch my sister in the head. He knew how to navigate that. But he didn't know how to navigate feeling sad. Because he too had had a splendid weekend and it was ending. Now, I said that I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways that this critical voice develops. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that no one, that moment of actually not so skillfulness on anyone's part never got repaired. What would happen? Well, we could imagine all sorts of things. That this child develops an idea about himself, that he is angry and bad, and furthermore, that anger is bad, and furthermore, that I don't even know how to deal with sadness because I don't even know that it's happening and I don't know the words for it. And so I think I will pretend that I am never sad. Because obviously it's a bad thing. So there are just all kinds of ways that our conditioned form, our conditioned personality can draw conclusions about aspects of our experience that are actually inaccurate. But that result from the ways that our experience was responded to when our brains were formed. He didn't have, as a 5-year-old, he didn't have the capacity to be aware of himself. He needed somebody outside of himself. I have another story, which I'll tell you, but probably not this week. I'll tell you next week, about somebody who did something very similar, who dealt with something very similar in a very different way. But he needed somebody outside of himself to read what was going on with him accurately and to help him navigate it. And if no one did ever, I'm not saying, if no one did ever, then he would draw all sorts of wrong conclusions about his experience. Last week, we talked a bit about how the critical voice tends to be a rather Western phenomenon. And I tell you that story because that sort of thing is less likely to happen, I understand, in non-Western cultures. In Western cultures, we have very specific ideas about how efficient we should be and how quickly children should learn, and they need to behave. And as a parent, we need to kind of be embarrassed if my child has a tantrum in the supermarket and other people are judging, and so that there's a lot more pressure on children. The understanding is there's a lot more pressure on children in the West to be a certain way that parents and or culture think they should be, and there's more room in the East for that moment to be a teaching moment. And for children to kind of learn to be curious about their own experience over time and to be able to navigate and go for help, if you will, when they have experience they don't understand. So, and the other point I wanted to make here too is that kind of phenomenon is especially pronounced if we have had some kind of traumatic experience that was not repaired. And approximately 30% of us have had traumatic experience many of which, when we were growing, many of which were not repaired. So if we've had traumatic experience that wasn't repaired, and or even if it's just that kind of a simple experience, what happens is actually twofold. One is the contents of experience. So in that case, that little boy's experience of sadness, he doesn't learn how to navigate the contents of his experience, which is sadness. But the other thing that researchers are now discovering is that not only does he not learn how to navigate the contents, but the architecture, if you will, of his brain, the way his brain would develop would actually prevent him over time from having the skills to learn how to navigate. You would have to kind of re-establish those neurons, literally, in order to learn how to navigate certain aspects of this experience. So when we talk about all experience being acceptable, in general, what we're looking at, and we need to kind of understand how these things get developed in the world of form, because otherwise what we tend to do is we tend to apply spiritual principles to our experience as a way actually of keeping them out of our awareness. So for example, let's imagine that little boy doesn't learn. Well, let me take a different example, because some of you have referenced this in some of your questions in the past. Let's imagine that a little girl, maybe more with little girls, learns that anger is, or no, it's not unique to little girls. Let's imagine that he learns that anger is a bad thing. That for him to be angry and to act out, that's the conclusion that he draws from that. And furthermore, I am a bad person because I am angry. Then he doesn't develop the facility over time to navigate either his anger or his mistakes or his sadness. And develops a critical voice, an internal critical voice, that when these things are wanting to arise in his experience, he then develops a practice as a spiritual practitioner of loving kindness to try to shut them down. Anybody ever tried to deal with their anger by loving kindness practice? There's a way of doing it, but not as a way of trying to shut it down. So loving kindness is a way, or emptiness as a way of just everything's fine. There's, everything's just, or non-dual, everything is just like ultimately wonderful and holy. And so then therefore I don't even notice when things are unskillful. That we can actually end up using our spiritual practice as a way of trying to shut ourselves down. Again, remember, another way we can actually try to shut ourselves down is with disregard. All of me or another is perfect, correct, wholesome, right, excellent, admirable, and splendid. And to do that, we have to be willing to not look too closely or listen to others too closely, in relationship where others say, yeah, maybe what you're doing isn't so cool. I know someone once asked Donald Trump if he ever looked at his own experience. And he said something along the lines of, he said, if I did, I wouldn't like what I saw. So no, I don't look at my experience. I don't take others' feedback. Everything I do is. So one way we can try to shut ourselves down by declaring everything is wonderful and fine. So we can not discern unskillful behavior in ourselves or others as a way of trying to shut down the uncomfortable feelings that we don't know how to navigate. Maybe even just confusion. You say, let's So the difference, again, knowing the difference between discerning what is wholesome, what leads to suffering for self or others, what leads to freedom, and criticism. And there's a Zen saying that goes something like, all of you is perfect, but parts of you could stand some improvement. So last time, so one other way that we kind of can ignore or avoid our experience are just the limits of the conscious mind. Remember that any given moment, this moment, our brain is processing 11 billion bits of information, of which we are conscious of 40. All of the rest of that goes into storage, and we often can't even access it with our conscious mind. So even if we try to think about it, what's going on here for me now? We try to think about it, we can't access it because it has gone so deep into storage. So the conscious mind can then go into criticism, say, well, it must be good. When maybe that's not it at all. It's like with me and my headset. Who knows what's going on? I don't know what's going on. So the limits of the conscious mind. And again, often on retreat, sometimes people can be really disturbed by what comes up on retreat. But what's coming up on retreat are some of those 10,999,960 neurons. When we're really quiet, some of that information starts to surface, and it can kind of freak us out if we have an agenda that experience is unacceptable. And then we can try to shut it down by criticizing it or by figuring it out. Anybody ever have the experience of desperately trying to figure out why you are having some experience that you're having? Or for that matter, why somebody else is having an experience that they're having? You know, the mind doesn't like confusion. It wants to figure it out. Okay. So again, this frontier. So in terms of our spiritual practice, I alluded to this both last week and now, we tend to interpret the vast spiritual teachings through these filters that we've already established in our form. And so if in our experience, if our constructed personality, we have a view that I am like this, other people are like that, this experience is wholesome, that experience isn't, then we tend to interpret the spiritual teachings through that filter and use them to continue to bypass our actual experience. So, I was saying before, so we can use loving kindness practice incorrectly to try to bypass our experience. Or we can use our understanding of loving kindness, for example. So I'm in an abusive relationship and I can think I should just be loving and kind to this person who is being abusive, rather than learning how to contact with my own sense of, if you will, righteous anger and set some real boundaries. So we can use it to try to bypass. John Wellwood says, in a society like ours, and John, and I've given you a couple references. In John's work, he talks a good bit about all of this. And he talks about spiritual bypassing. He says, in a society like ours, it is tempting to use spirituality as a way to try to rise above the shaky ground of entanglements in form, emotions, personality, and social conditioning. In this way, spirituality becomes just another way of rejecting one's experience. Adopting a rationale based on using absolute truth to deny or disparage relative truth, the truth of our form, the truth of what's happening in the moment. Absolute truth is what is eternally and universally true. now and forever beyond any particular viewpoint. Psychological realities, conditioned realities, represent relative and personal truth. They are relative to particular individuals in particular circumstances. Okay. So the confusion that drives that is not understanding at what level we are working at. Are we working in the world of form, where what we need to be doing is setting limits, being clear, are we working in the world of the absolute? Another thing that John talks about, which is similar to what Ajahn Suchito talks about, he calls it a spiritual superego. So in another direction, he says, in addition to spiritual bypassing as a way to avoid our experiencing, there's what he calls a spiritual superego, recruiting teachings from the absolute to judge our experience and our conditioning. To judge our experience and our early conditioning, the experiences we had as our brain was developing in the world of form. He says he calls it a harsh inner voice that acts as a relentless critic and judge, telling them that nothing they do is ever quite good enough. You should meditate more and practice harder. You are too self-centered, or too angry, or too passive, or too fill in the blanks. You don't have enough devotion. So they strive to be more dharmically correct, attempting to be more detached, compassionate, kind, or devoted than they really are. In trying to live up to high spiritual ideals, they deny their real feelings, becoming cut off from their bodily vitality, the truth of their own experience, and their ability to find their own authentic direction. Okay, so instead of mindfulness, sometimes we can find this sort of subtle judgment that, sort of like, well, it's like this now, but really it shouldn't be. This is your experience right now, but if you're really spiritually correct, my voice is dropping. It's dropping on purpose. Because if you were spiritually correct, you would be not having this experience that you are experiencing. So the critic, I wanted to kind of take some time to just talk about how this critic develops and how we can recruit our spiritual practice and really confuse ourselves terribly by confusing what level we're working with. It's 8:25. I promise you that I will go to. Let me just see. Yeah, I promise that I will go to how to work with this as part of our spiritual practice next time. I have another nice story. Next time, July 5th, 2 weeks from now. Okay, so next time I will start with my story again, my new story, and we'll talk about, so how do we work with this? Okay, here we are, all of us, with varying size wheelbarrows, in varying circumstances. Sometimes we can have a very, very big truck, and other times we can be shocked at the little thimble of awareness that we have. So how do we navigate? And maybe for starters, to be aware of, well, how big is my capacity at the moment? So thank you, everybody. To be continued again.